just to make sure we're all on the same page to start with, ornithology is the scientific study of birds. And just in case you've gotten bum information from earlier talks, this is the bestology, okay? Others are okay, ornithology is the best. So I want to do a little bit about why study birds to start out with, just in case you wonder why people would spend their time doing it. And the origins is that as humans, we're fascinated by flight. You know, we're fascinated by song and color, and birds are visual creatures like we are. So there's a lot of empathy. And of the flying creatures, this is the most successful one out there. There's about 10,000 species. They exist on every bit of the planet. They've even been spotted at the South Pole. There's incredible diversity of flight. They range from species that might not flap their wings for a day, you know, albatrosses flying around the oceans, to birds like the hummingbird here that can fly backwards, for heaven's sake. So they're pretty damn cool. And people care about birds. They're in the news all the time. So the New York Times, for example, has a link to birds for people who want birds in the news. And some of the bird news is associated with, you know, humans intruding farther and farther into the landscape, and you probably heard a little bit about human footprints. Here's one of my favorite examples. Now this is a depiction of distance and nearest McDonald's. So this is one of the non-traditional human footprints. But some of the news is bad. So a couple years ago there was an international news was made in India during a hawk's migration that over 100,000 animals were being killed for food, and it was in violation of international treaties. A lot of news about it, but then good news a year later. Because of the international news, there was a lot of work done in the area by bird conservation groups in the next year. If you believe the reports, none of them were killed. So news can be on the good side and the bad side. So why study birds? They're economically important. The best known bird groups out there are ducks and geese, largely because we've been eating them for thousands, if not millions of years. Most of you have probably had or encountered chickens and eggs recently. We use their feathers for bedding. They're kept as pets. 150 years ago, if you went into the average person's home, birds were really common pets. And we use them to stuff coats. This is an unusual coat up here. This is each of those white blobs is actually a bird skin from a species like this called an auklet. It's a marine bird. They just stitched a bunch together to make a nice down coat. They're important, as I mentioned, because we do hunting. Hunting generates billions of dollars a year just in the US, and a lot of that's for birds. You're probably familiar with, you know, duck hunting is fairly common, but even things like this mourning dove over here, tens of millions of them are shot every year as food. But even more people are involved in bird watching. Are there any bird watchers here? Yeah, see, it's a good audience, I knew it. According to the Fish and Wildlife Service, there are almost 63 million wildlife watchers. I'm not sure what you had to do to count as one, but a lot of money's spent watching wildlife. So here's a comparison between how much money is spent hunting, fishing versus wildlife watching, and a large part of this is birds. I mean, it might boggle your mind, but we spend over $3 billion a year in the US just on bird food. Okay, so we're talking a lot of money here. And they're cool. The coolest, actually. There's high species diversity. Even though they're limited by the constraints to flight, there's an enormous amount of diversity in mouth parts and plumage. This bird you see in the bottom left is a bee hummingbird. It's the smallest bird in the world, and yes, that's the whole thing right there between his fingers. And the famous picture of Sir Richard Owen next to a moa. They went extinct in New Zealand after humans got there and discovered how tasty they were. So there's a lot of size range, not as big as mammals, but better than mammals. The diversity you see with the birds is a lot of it's in color. And the bills I mentioned earlier, flamingos feed upside down using filter feeding. see, I've got an analog pointer here. So, a crushing bill of a seed eater up there. In the bottom right is a bird that eats fish by flying along with its mandible in the water, and when it hits a fish, it just pops it into its mouth. So an enormous amount of diversity out there. They've got haunting songs, and I'm playing this not just to show you how cool their songs are, but because it ties you to an important ornithology database with a guy who's not excited about it at all. If you go to northern Maine right now, you'll hear this in the woods. Beautiful song. But the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has one of the biggest audio-visual libraries in the world for ornithology. Let's see which button takes me back. And birds have very bizarre displays. Here's a pair of grebes that are in courtship display. They're running on water, and a number of grebes have these odd displays. I want to show you another clip that's out of the Cornell Lab of a bizarre display. This is why people love birds. Yeah. I don't know if you can hear the wind going through its wings. So how could this not attract the attention of people? I'll save you the agony. She ignores him and flies off. Birds are dinosaurs. How cool is that? This depiction here, in the bottom left, this is a recent rendition of what a velociraptor really looks like. So, kids love dinosaurs. You can study them live, people. And birds are central to a lot of modern ideas in biology. This is just a list of the fields that I could fit onto a slide of all the different areas where birds are either central for being studied or results about their study were being used to apply to other systems like human systems. But there's a little bit of confusion, I think, with whether you're an ornithologist or not. And I know I was asked to talk about ornithology, but I wanted to let you know that just because you work on birds doesn't make you an ornithologist. So research with birds is not necessarily the same as research on birds. So birds are often used as a study system for other things such as humans. And I want to just show you a contrast here in how people view themselves. So these are the 4 people that I know of at Tufts University that do research on birds. Michael Romero studies stress physiology, and almost all of his research is on birds, and I asked him if he considered himself an ornithologist, and he said reluctantly. So he didn't used to, but he's worked so much on them, he does now, but he wanted me to make it clear to you that he does not watch birds. I took him birding once a long time ago, and he still talks about it with some amount of trauma. I asked him what he needed from a librarian besides the traditional support, and what he really needs is searching and finding alternative research techniques to satisfy the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. He's the chair of our committee, and I appreciate it because there are only a few of us use something besides a rat, and he has to explain to them what real animals are. Bob Cook is in the psychology department, so we had a physiologist, now a psychologist. Works on animal cognition, learning and memory, and most of his research is on birds. I asked him if he considered himself an ornithologist, and he said, I could. It's not my first choice, but I can. And the thing he highlighted for what he needed from librarians was help with data archiving and management. As you know, it's now mandatory for some of the funding agencies that you develop a plan. Got a new person in our department named Mimi Cow who works on neural mechanisms underlying sensory motor learning, what I call song. She works on birds, and I asked her if she was an ornithologist, and she said no. She said, I work on birds because they're a useful system. Okay, she doesn't So just because you work on a bird doesn't necessarily make you an ornithologist, but you probably have to help them anyhow. And most of her literature searching is done in the biomedical literature, although she does know that the work she's doing in song, trying to find related species, that these birdsong archives are important to her. You've already heard what I do. Yes, I'm an ornithologist, and I'm very needy. So I've only listed a few things here, but most of the rest of the talk is about my needs, so I'll go into those later. I want to take a minute to talk about whether the field of ornithology is dead, which might seem like a strange thing to talk about, but it's talked a lot about in the professional circles. You know, for the last 30 years in this country, ology courses, herpetology, ornithology, mammalogy, have been on the decline. They're disappearing from curricula or across the US. In addition, membership in societies that specialize in taxonomic groups is plummeting also. So I'm a member of a bunch of these organizations, but to take an example, the American Ornithologists Union, which is the largest one, in the last 15 years, it's lost 40% of its membership. Now that doesn't sound good. It sounds like ornithology's on its way out. You know, it used to be that if you wanted the journals, and here are just some of the ornithology journals put out by societies, that you needed to be a member of the society to get the journal, and that's no longer true. It used to be that going to conferences was the way you developed your professional network, and that's less true than it used to be. And over the last 30 years, there's been this shifting emphasis away from ologies into newer, narrower fields. So here's a graph from a paper that just came out in Bioscience a couple years ago showing the addition of new new biology organizations in the US. So this was a survey done by the AIBS. And what you can see is if you look into the 70s and 80s and 90s, there was a huge jump in the number of societies out there and not necessarily much of a jump in the number of people working in them. So you're starting to draw people into these other organizations. This is also from that same paper, and what I wanted to point out was if you look back in the 70s, growth in these societies was rapid. So the blue bar there is memberships doubling. And as you go up across the decades, you'll see we go from 22 organizations to 69. But by the time you get to the most recent decade, what you see is that yellow bar, which is membership decreasing by over 5%. And the blue bar, which was membership doubling, is almost gone. So there's a lot of shift out of dilution, out of societies, and people affiliating themselves with other organizations. So what I think is that ornithology is certainly not dead. Here's a graph from Scopus of papers published that just had the keyword bird or birds in it. It's going up. The societies might be in trouble, but birds as research organisms and people studying birds is going up steadily. So what are the challenges? And this is definitely from my perspective, and I'm going to ignore the oddities of working with quirky type A people that you have to deal with as an aside. All right, so you just saw this slide a minute ago. You have to be familiar with a lot of fields of biology. And there isn't just, oh, the ornithology journal and the one topic they cover. You have to know a lot of different biology. And every one of these fields has their own topic-specific research tool. So just a handful of examples here: molecular genetics. I have a friend who works on foraging ecology in birds and had to learn about how water tension worked along a bill when the bird was feeding. You might have to know about aerodynamics if you're studying flight, or neurotransmission if you're looking at memory development. So there's a lot of et cetera out there. So this shift out of ology fields and into newer divisions of biology makes it, the shift I think makes it easier to deal with as a science librarian because the focus is narrower, the number of journals dealing with the topic is narrower, And you can actually find a finite number of classic papers in the field. Here's what you need to know as your basis, and your history works forward from there. But the ologies, because they're taxonomically based, they cross a lot of fields, there's no limit. There's no edge to the boundaries of what you have to know. So there's a classic set of papers in every single field that touches in on ornithology. So let me just give you an example here. So a developmental biologist nowadays goes to developmental biology meetings, and that's it. But an ornithologist might go to bird meetings, ecology, behavior, conservation biology. They might go to a materials science meeting, climate change, and developmental biology. So as a need out of librarians, you've got to be a jack of all trades rather than a specialist in any one field if you're trying to support all the different things that people do under the guise of working with birds. And that's a lot, so I thought you should just take a minute and digest that and look at another nice picture. Okay. So that's a lot of stuff. All right. How about literature and data? None of your traditional challenges have gone away. Okay, so everything that's out there now is new stuff you have to add on to it. You don't get to drop anything. So you still need to know about the ornithology journals. You have to know that the ostrich is published in Australia, and maybe you don't have it in the library, so you've got to get your interlibrary loan people working. A lot of journals publish research on birds, and there's actually been a lot of push and a lot of pressure from universities to publish in things besides bird journals, even if you're an ornithologist, because the prestige is higher. You know, the IBIS sounds like a provincial journal, even though it's the oldest professional journal in the realm. It doesn't sound very important. You need to publish in Science of the Global Environment or something that sounds cooler. You need to be familiar with compendia, so hard copies and online. So the Birds of North America series. I don't know if you've seen the Handbook of Birds of the World. Have you seen the online version of this thing? Get it. It's dirt cheap. Okay, you as an individual can get it for $50 a year. If you want the attached literature, it's $80 a year. I think for the library it's $500. I can't remember. It's real. My librarian emailed me, say if I want, and then emailed me, say, what's wrong with it? It's so cheap. Something must be wrong. But it's got a lot of fantastic added resources to it, and as phylogenies change, it just updates it automatically. Digital journal databases, we still need you for sleuthing. There's a lot of stuff I want to know about that, and I feel like I'm good at searching, but I still have to go ask for help because I can't find some things sometimes, and it irks me. An interlibrary loan. I just sent in an interlibrary loan this week and got the document 2 hours later. Now, that's too fast, okay? I would actually like a moment to do something else before this comes rushing in, but it was pretty damn impressive. There's a challenge with preserving these resources. I'm certain I don't need to tell you all about this, but I did want to acknowledge that resources are being cut and databases are disappearing, and we weep with you. Then you'd have to know about slightly more obscure information sources. So a lot of publications in books don't show up in Web of Science or Scopus, like Current Ornithology. It's published in book form every year, and it only shows up once in a while in databases. Avian Conservation and Ecology is an online journal that, unless it's changed in the last few months, Scopus covers it, Web of Science doesn't. But Scopus only covers it from volume 6 on. That's really annoying. Government documents, I know it's a traditional section for you all that you're deeply immersed into, but there's a lot of them. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with things like the U.S. Forest Service publications, their general technical reports, but how many of you knew that the USGS has a Pacific Islands Water Science Center publications? Okay, that's a little more obscure, but because I do a lot of research on water birds in Hawaii, it's something that I use a lot. And university extension publications have often been ignored in a lot of the scientific literature before the advent of conservation biology, but with conservation being a more applied field, a lot of these resources are being used. Museum publications often don't show up in the databases, so probably the best known one out there is Novitates from the American Museum of Natural History, but the Bishop Museum has them. California something or other used to publish books and now they don't. And there are local ornithology journals. Has anyone here ever heard of the Chat or the Elepaio? Yeah, I've cited stuff out of the Elepaio. It's a Hawaiian Audubon Society publication. Speaking of, I wanted to say another nice thing about my interlibrary loan people. I needed a Coast Guard report from Hawaii from 1915. Showed up in a week. I thought, I've got them on this. They're never going to find this one. In fact, the only thing I've ever asked for and not gotten was a City of Honolulu job report from the 70s. Okay, and then I found someone who had it, so I got it. But I was impressed. That's the only thing that they've never gotten for me.
Is that a thing to try to stop the ILL people? Is that something you guys do?
Oh man, I've been so happy with, if you're not at a big school, having a good ILL takes care of a lot. Oh, actually, I do try to, but I only ask for stuff I want. But I like obscure things, so it works out pretty well. But they've been up to the challenge. Another thing that you have that you're not going to get in, say, the neuro talk you heard yesterday, old data are still useful to us. And I run into all my grad students, I have to teach them about these things because they've never heard of them because they were born in 2000 or whenever. For example, it's worth knowing that in the early 1900s, Ridgway produced an 11-volume Birds of North and Middle America that has body size measurements, egg size measurements, distributional data. And I have a student who's working on a paper right now on Caribbean birds where she's using that information. It's available online. Because I work on Hawaiian birds, I need to know that Rothschild wrote The Avifauna of Laysan in 1893. It's available at the Smithsonian Institute's webpage. What if I need an article out of the Auk from volume 6? That was 1889. Turns out there's a database, there's a place called SORA. Do you know about this? The Searchable Ornithological Research Archive. It's searchable PDFs from volume 1 for all the bird journals. And this has been really valuable. Also, there's a glut of new journals, in case you didn't notice. There are a lot more societies, as we talked about, and there's a lot more open source journals. And one of the things we need education on is which ones are the predatory ones. Which ones should we be avoiding like the plague? I don't know if that's a good list or not, but I found it. And thumbs up, all right. But these guys are pretty sneaky. There's been a proliferation of data repositories. Some of the funders now require it. Some of the journals now require them. And so the Proceedings of the Royal Society said, we require that all data be made available. So they have a link to Dryad. And in fact, if you need money to store stuff there, they will pay for up to 10 gigs of your data to be stored at Dryad. So that's just one possibility. If you're working on birds, one of the things that some people do is take advantage of museum specimens. And there are museum specimens, a lot of them all over the place. And there's a database that started a few years ago called Ornis that is most, but not all, of the large museum collections in the US in a searchable database. I want to know if there's a kestrel that was captured in Washington before a population decline. I can go look it up and get it. So they have millions of specimens on record there. And I've already showed you a couple of examples out of the Macaulay Library. They've recently made it completely open to the public because they want people using the information. This is not supposed to be a comprehensive list. What it's supposed to be is an alert that there's some big data repositories out there and they keep popping up and it's kind of annoying. Well, I mean, from a I'd like to get some data, I don't know where to look point of view. So the North American Breeding Bird Survey is pretty standard and commonly used. It's for bird counts in the US, Canada, and Mexico. Global Population Dynamics Database is a place I've gone and gotten time series of population sizes for different species from all over the world. This morning I got an email saying, hey, there's a new vital rates of North American land birds database now available. Vital rates are reproductive success and survival and longevity. All of a sudden there's a database available for that. MoveBank just came online maybe in the last year or so, and this is a repository for animal tracking data. So you put some radios on an animal, follow it around, you've written your paper on it, you'd like someone else to use it, you just load it up there. One of my favorite websites is the Conservation Evidence webpage, which was started by Bill Sutherland, who's a conservation biologist, and his goal was to do something like is done in medicine, which has evidence-based practice. Here are a bunch of things that have been done and what the result is. They've become a repository for people to put management actions, and there are over 450 of them in from bird studies that they've put together into a book that's a free download. Here are 3 databases of bird phylogenies. Why do we need more than one? It turns out people disagree with each other about bird phylogeny. And I think some funding agencies want you to do something new. Oh, I'll create a phylogeny. No one's ever done that before. I don't know how GigaNDB is, if there's a clever way to pronounce that. And then you've got people who are doing landscape ecology. I'd like to know how is changes in land use or changes due to climate going to affect bird populations? So I need spatial data. And here's just a few of hundreds of land use databases. It's worth, if you can have somebody just specializing in spatial data around, because they keep popping up all over the place and folks are constantly scanning old maps and creating new databases. I'm not sure what an unharmonized world soil database is, but I really liked that as a concept. Okay, another breather. We're almost done. This is my favorite sparrow photo. All right, citizen science. Has this popped up as a need? It's been around for a long time, but we didn't call it that. Knowing what citizen science is and where the data are and what you can use from it and what makes good citizen science is useful. And it's particularly poignant here because the biggest citizen science projects in the country are all about ornithology. So I mentioned the North American Breeding Bird Survey. This is, was started in the 60s by the US Fish and Wildlife Service, now the USGS and the Canadian Wildlife Service control the databases. They've got 4,100 25-mile bird routes that are walked every year, and a lot of publications have come out analyzing bird population trends over time. Christmas bird count was started by the National Audubon Society in 1900 as an alternative for people to not shoot stuff, because there used to be holiday traditions of let's go out and shoot things. And some folks said, hey, there's some alternatives, let's go out and just count things. Project Feeder Watch was started by Long Point Bird Observatory in the 70s, got taken over by the Cornell Lab for Ornithology. One of the biggest ones right now is EBird. Now, birders here have probably heard of it, but it's a database that's being coordinated out of the Cornell Labs again, where birders, every time they go birding, they record what they saw and how many they saw and where they saw them. Yes, we're that nerdy. Okay, just get over it and deal with it. But for every species now, you can get species range maps. So there's a range map of the Savannah sparrow. These are all from birders. I have a friend who, while he birds, he just enters the data as he goes along. From that information, you can get charts of when the species are around. If you're going birding somewhere, you can find out what's seen there. But let me show you one of the cooler things that's come out of it, which is putting all this information together over time and creating a dynamic map of observations. So what you're seeing is birds on the wintering grounds. Now they're migrating north. Now this is birds on the breeding grounds. And now you'll see them move back south again. So these maps are now available for birds all over North America. And one of the things people are finding out from this is some of the migration routes are different than what we thought in the past. And hey, there are these common routes where they go north one way and south another way. So this is all coming out of citizen science. The guy who started, I don't know how to make that stop, so I'll ignore it. The guy who started the breeding bird survey was Chan Robbins. He worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and he told me that he still has his letter of reprimand in his folder for starting this. He was told that that you can't trust untrained people, so they reprimanded him, and he kept it because he thought that was pretty funny. And there's a bunch of ornithological organizations out there, and some of them are really useful. They provide information on grant availability, on jobs, highlighting recent articles in other journals. And some of them I don't even know what they do yet because I just found some. The Avian Knowledge Network. That sounds important, right? American Ornithology, which I thought was put out by the same people as the Ornithology Exchange, and it's not. Partners in Flight is an organization that works on saving migratory birds in North, Central, and South America. Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network is same group, but just for shorebirds. So there's a lot of organizations out there, and some of them are great data repositories. BirdLife International has great information on population size, risk status, things like that. The raptor people, you got to watch out for raptor people. They're kind of odd in the bird world because they work on macho stuff. So they have their own meeting and their own journal. So they've got their own information network. Now they're not unfriendly. They're just different from other ornithologists. You can ask Nat. I'm not wrong. Now I don't know. Do you guys get asked about jobs in ornithology? The Ornithology Exchange posts seasonal jobs and permanent jobs. Within ecology and wildlife and ornithology, for some reason the Texas A&M job board is the best job board out there. And it's been the best job board for 30 years. I have no idea who started it or why it's the best thing out there, but if you want wildlife jobs, they've got everything and it's free. So these are just some of the examples of things that I hand out to students. So no wonder you're exhausted.